Hey everybody, welcome to BDE pre-Chuck heading to Vegas for the World Women's Poker Tournament edition.
Which one will this be for you?
I don't know how many I've actually gone to. It's the 18th overall because we started the same year the poker tournament and the roast. So I believe this will be the 18th roast. It's the 18th World Women's Poker Tournament. I think they've got a record crowd this year, some 350, 400 people going. So it'll be interesting to be out there, get the pulse, see what people are
Yeah.
thinking.
How many have you made of those 18?
Maybe about half of them.
And what's your high water mark?
High water mark, I finished ninth. I made the final table 1 year. Gosh, that was probably 8 or 9 years ago, something like that. It was a fun story because what we used to do back in the day, back when I was rich and had my plane, we would take off and we would just go pick up all the CEOs in the portfolio. So we would stop off in Dallas, Tulsa, Oak City, Denver. And it would take 8 or 9 hours to get there, but it was with a bunch of folks you liked. I had good wine on the plane. So it was like a flying cocktail party. So we did it and it was fun. And anyway, one time I'm on the plane, I'm sitting there talking to Carl Brinsecki, who's the best poker player in our industry. He started it as well as he's won it 4 times. He's hands down the best poker player we've got. And anyway, I'm like, Carl, what's the issue? Why do I suck? And he goes, you just pay way too much to see a flop. He goes, I don't want you to play a hand at this tournament unless you're willing to raise it. And I was like, oh, okay. So I just sat there and basically folded all day long and they get the tournament done in one day. So they jack the blinds and up ridiculously as it goes along. But over the 7-hour period, I played 14 hands and I won 12 of them. And that's how I made the final table. I just don't have the patience to play good poker because playing good poker is just folding, right?
It is. And I play by the book blackjack, so I haven't played in any high stakes poker tournaments. So what's the qualifier, or how do you get invited?
Kurt Hartman's in charge, and you ask Kurt for an invite. So if you want to go next year, let me know.
Hopefully I'll have some money by then.
There we go. Yep. All right. Story number 1. What's going on in energy?
Well, we had this order actually got issued last week. It's been a bit in the headlines, and I think energy specific headlines have maybe taken a bit of a back seat, but the Bureau of Energy Management issued a halt work order to Equinor, which is the developer constructor of the New York's Empire Wind. They're currently in the throes of construction of a very large offshore New York wind project that was fully permitted from a state and federal level, but Interior and to some extent Commerce, which actually oddly has marine fisheries under its umbrella, basically forced the halt to do some additional environmental assessment. So, what's good for the goose here is good for the gander. It's what it looks like. And, this is not trivial to Equinor because they're, I think, $1.5 billion drawn on their facility. And, they've certainly got some equity risk if this thing ultimately does not move forward. They've got termination payments that they have to make to suppliers, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a pretty meaty deal given that the project is in motion. And, we can argue about what the permitting stipulations were under fast tracking all this stuff over the last 4 or 5 years. But we've also spent some time on this show. I wish Kirk was here talking about his observations of from the accident,
dead whales.
Dead
right?
whales. So Trump's been pretty fiery in his rhetoric about hating wind, et cetera. So this feels like a kind of a headline. We can score some points here. We're going to follow through on what we said we were going to do. By the way, everybody ought to be concerned about the things that are evident in the environmental and wildlife areas that were apparently just kind of sped past. Those were caution lights that were sped past to get this thing fast tracked and under construction.
What's the line from the movie Wall Street? Tell me how I feel about it. It's like Lord Wyman going off the cliff, but in my brand new Ferrari. I mean,
yeah,
a brand new Maserati, whatever it is. It's kind of, I've got mixed emotions on this. I'm not a wind fan. That being said, if somebody wants to go build wind farms, I'm not sure they're that bad for the environment versus anything else we do. I mean, yes, there's some concerns there. We should study them. But I think I'd be a hypocrite if I stopped a wind project because of environmental concerns.
And recall that there have been a number of higher profile project cancellations and pullbacks, and that's just the confluence of events related to primarily what was going on and what has been going on with materials inflation and interest rates. So you've got PUCs that are part and parcel of these things, taking a look at what these projects are ultimately going to get finished in terms of cost and budgeting, and what that implies for decisions on rate cases and what it ultimately means for the cost of powers and the decisions that are made by the PUCs that are involved in these things.
Maybe going off the cliff in two of my Maseratis.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, no, I mean if subsidies were removed, tax credits withdrawn as part of tax law change, I might be okay there, because that's, hey, if you're going to make an economic decision based on tax law and Congress can change the tax law, then so be it. The environmental stuff feels a little petty, but to your point, payback's a bitch.
What have we been about in U.S. politics, at least at the federal level? And I would argue at most levels, if you pay any attention to state level politics, we've petty's a good word.
Petty is a good word.
And this is just another one. Equinor has said that they're certainly evaluating their alternatives, which I would assume, and what the article implies, is looking at litigation and judicial relief would probably be the blindingly obvious paths to maybe undo this, like everything else that's come out of the last, what is it now, 100 days or so. Right. Didn't we just reach the 100th day of the administration?
Yes. We're on whatever number injunction we are of something. I will say this, as a former political science major who made an A in constitutional law, I do think Congress shall make no ex post facto laws. Is a pretty important principle. If you can change the law to go screw people retroactively, that's really bad. That's giving too much power to the government. And this has a bit of ex post facto, hey, we're going to yank a permit we said yes to, nature to it. So I don't like that, but I do think
the construction started. So on phase one. So
Yeah.
yeah, this is
Yeah.
putting the brakes on, well after the starting gun was fired.
Exactly. So with that,
And
why don't we talk
it's gonna
about
be
this?
interesting to see, because when you balance that against some other things that we're trying to get done, and we'll talk about it here in the next item, is, we talked. I know we talked too much about Canada last time, but uh, the
Blame Canada with their beady little
this is
eyes.
this is just really accelerating the permitting process, and there's going to have to be a lot of that to ultimately make the structural shift that we're trying to make in the symbolism, the rhetoric around things like, a minerals deal with Ukraine, or some type of annexation or deal to bring Greenland into our protectorate, is kind of the way I think about it, in going after these raw materials and resources. But so that kind of leads into the next item, which is on some rare earths, the Chinese government basically said we're going to ban exports. And if you look at just about everything we use and the military uses in daily life, we've got a number of those rare earths and their derivative products and components in them, everything from military aircraft to cell phones, and a lot of elements that most of us can't even pronounce. But so this is not unprecedented that the Chinese have done this. They threatened it during Trump's first term. There was also some territorial dispute with Japan, where there was a ban, or a threatened ban, on exports to Japan. And this is kind of a who's going to blink.
Right.
We do have a high concentration in not only rare earths, raw rare earths, but I think the important element here, or the important segment of the value chain of rare earths, is the Chinese have got a stranglehold on processing and refining of those rare earths. And so, for us to affect some kind of reshoring and structural shift and building the capacity domestically to do all this stuff is certainly not measured in a period of time between now and Election Day in 2026, and maybe not even in 2028. How fast can you set up one of these, for lack of a better term, rare earth refineries? And so there's a bit of a high wire act going on here. With, yes, the strategic long-term aim is to diversify the supply risk, which we should have started long ago, because rare earths are not rare. They're just distributed in very low concentrations. You got to dig up a lot of stuff to get at the quantities of the purity of the rare earths that you want. But the mining is one thing. It's the rest of the supply chain that has got a cycle time on it to get it developed and find alternatives. That's going to take, I think, more time than we've got politically.
Well, and I have always said on BDE, on Chuck Yates Needs a Job, that at the end of the day, America does a crisis really well. I mean, day to day, we don't do so great. A lot of other countries, I think, do day to day better than we do. But when the Nazis muster up and want to come after Europe, okay, we got you guys, etc. We do a crisis really well. The problem we're having is, I think there is a call to patriotism that underlies that ability, that the nation needs us. My grandmother's going to go run a riveting factory to build stuff. I think the false alarm crisis we just went through in COVID has really taken the wind out of the sails for us wanting to cede power to the government to deal with a crisis. And so maybe I'm conflating all that or making that up. It just seems like the kind of folks that would say, okay, let's, go build a rare earth processing plant here. Let's go start mining here. Let's pass laws that allow us to do that, are saying, man, I don't want to give that power to the government. Look at what's going on now. So and what was causing me to rethink this is on the drive back from the office today, I was listening to folks talk about, we literally have imported 15 million people into the United States during the Biden term. And there are folks there that want us to have full-blown court cases to be able to export one. And that, you run through the math, we export, 350,000 people a year. That number of trials would take 250 years. It would take longer than the Republic's been around.
Yeah, you're talking about deportations.
Yeah, and where I was going with that is just there are people willing to game the system. So I'm becoming more sympathetic to the people of, I just don't want to play along with the system. And I think belief in the system and patriotism is ultimately why we deal with crisis very well. Coming back to the point you're making, I do think it's a crisis that we don't mine here. We don't process rare earths here. We should be doing all of that stuff together, along with creating more cheaper energy to be able to run AI stuff here. I think that's equally crisis. And we've talked about that almost every episode. But I'll get off my soapbox, but that's a thought I had this afternoon.
I think there's a lot of noise in the whole, what should we reshore and manufacture here? And I think Jack McClendon said he's been fairly critical in some of his recent tweets.
I like Jack, but when is he not critical?
He said, I think his metaphor was on kind of economic policy execution here. It's akin to doing a root canal with a 12 gauge.
Yeah.
But you're right. You're on to something. The profile, let's take the World War II kind of call to arms and patriotism and all that. The critical industries that we need to dominate, that we need to reshore for national security, are things like rare earths and a supply chain that is protected from or diversified away from, monopoly or monopolist who's an adversary like China, and at least have the security diversification, whether we're going to bring all of that mining and processing back within, the friendly confines of the U.S. remains to be seen. And, we do stand the risk of having export bans really cripple our development of things like new technologies and AI, et cetera, because a lot of the source components come from, places like China that we've now decided to engage in a bit of a trade conflict. Now, there's a lot of stuff that shouldn't be brought back here, but during war, in the lead up, in the midst of World War II, who was better equipped, both from a technology capacity to do it and a cost standpoint, to produce all that stuff that we needed? We were. We were the world's leading industrial power.
Yeah, and who had the East Texas oil field?
We did.
Was us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you touched on it in one of your recent podcasts on your probably second favorite subject. It may be your favorite subject, the Jones Act. I mean, what is more critical to our ability to trade and protect ourselves and mobilize power around the world than ships? And we are woefully behind, certainly China, in terms of our capacity and ability to build ships. We've talked about that before too.
Yeah, we built 5 last year, and they built 1,900. I think is the numbers I've seen. So
So our strategic policy objectives generally make sense. We need that stuff here. The tactics, though, when you're faced with someone who can literally cut off your supply with the flip of a policy switch, like China can, that dominates or is such a dominant supplier of some of these key items, everything from pharmaceuticals to rare earths and processed rare earths, et cetera. The tactical and strategic timelines here are mismatched. And if we get out of sync again politically, and we shift back to, the opposition party having much more of an ability to engage in more petty quid pro quos, then that just slows things down.
I got a DM this week from an anon who was listening to last week's BDE, and they said, yeah, everybody talks about pipe and steel, and that's the tariff, but you got to remember valves, wellheads, everything is going to get hit by tariffs, as well as chemicals. Yeah. They're budgeting for a lot in the way of supplies. Are from chemicals. Or a lot of the suppliers of chemicals come from China as well, and so they're seeing AFEs across the board going up.
I guess the way I think about it is the electorate going to have the patience to be okay with the uncertainty, the upset, the turmoil of looking longer term and sticking with the strategic timeline to affect this structural shift that this is about, or are we going to keep flip-flopping and have these wide pendulum swings politically, because we're now 17 months away from 2026 midterms.
Yeah, and even I think we'll do a better job today than we would have 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. But having the patience to just understand the argument. Hey, guys, we have to go mine here. Hey, we have to buy a smeltering plant. We will build a smeltering plant, et cetera. We will do it as environmentally safe as we humanly can. But we have to go do it. And if we don't go do it, so far the public has fallen for, it's okay if I have my iPhone and we build it in China and they process all the minerals over there. Somehow I'm not polluting here because I'm a good person. We got to come back and just really nail home. There's no peeing and non-peeing section of the pool. Sorry. That's just life.
Well, that goes for emissions and human rights too. And, you look at the amount of Congo mine cobalt in just about everything we use on the technology side. So out of sight, out of mind. And we're politically okay with that. A lot of double standards in all of this, and it's very complex. You want to talk about oil?
All right, hold on. Chuck Yates, when it comes to oil production in the nation, is like an LA weatherman. It's going to be sunny, 72 degrees today, and I could just hit replay and I'd lose my job because once a year it actually rains. So yes, we peaked and we're declining. Bam.
That's what you're saying.
And isn't that what I've said? I guess sometimes I've been intellectually honest enough to say we should have peaked and be declining. I don't understand why we keep going up. So two things on that. One, Chicken Little was right finally at the end, and the broken watch is right twice a day.
Right. Yeah, we used to use that description about the futures curve. It's like isn't that an Alice in Wonderland thing?
Right through the looking glass.
A stopwatch is right twice a day.
Yes.
Yeah. So there's a tweet from HFI Research that caught my eye, and I forget who had reposted it. I'm mixing X and Twitter here. Sorry, but they had a graph on basically U.S. oil production for the EIA 914 and then the EIA 914 adjusted for petroleum supply monthly. And you do see and we'll post this, you do see over the last, really since mid-year last year, you've got a pretty evident, and it's a pretty severe sawtooth set of curves. But the more interesting thing, or the kind of the subplot here, is U.S. gas production continues to rise. And it's as if we're just once again rediscovering that, we've got a rising GOR problem. And that's only going to get worse if we continue to, or if we set about reducing completions here in response to a bit of a queasy time here in commodity prices and reining back on capital. So U.S. gas production just hit 107 BCF a day. We've got plateauing oil. It's just the nature of the beast. And so what do you do with all of that? Resumption of growth is going to be accompanied by higher and higher gas rates, and even plateauing and declining because of, the physics of rising GOR.
Is it your sense, or do you know? And this may be a question. I know some of the world's best petroleum engineers, reservoir engineers, will be out at WAP. Like Thad Toops from Haas will be out there, and I'll ask them. I wonder if that GOR is baked into the reserve estimates. I would think at this point in the shale revolution, with as many wells as we've produced, as long as we've had production history, that's got to be baked in. This can't be surprising. But 5 years ago, let's go 7-8 years ago, it was shocking sometimes when you'd hit that bubble point, going, where the hell did all this gas come from? We didn't expect that.
Well, it's the nature of the beast. I don't care if it's conventional or shale reservoir. It's just the way it works from a reservoir and fluid standpoint. And so, as you deplete, you're going to go through the bubble point. You're going to see a lot more, as we call it, solution or associated gas. We have seen a lightening, I believe, of TI, and that's a function of just increasing GORs. And what this ultimately means, or why it matters, is because you certainly have less higher value component in your BOE stream, if you will. And it also creates operational issues with respect to, you run up against capacity limits. And I worked Prudhoe Bay back in the day, and we had a little bit of an internal contest about predicting when Prudhoe was going to go on decline. And it was largely, if not predominantly, driven by the limits of the gas handling capacity. We, ran these marginal GOR models, and, you're limited by the ability to handle and move gas, whether that's putting it in a pipe somewhere, putting it on a ship, or as they do at Prudhoe still to this day, they put most of it back in the gas cap. But you are rate limited, and as your pressure drops, you've got more and more gas in the equivalent stream, and that's it. Same with water, right? And we've had some discussion about water issues and et cetera, but that's what you're seeing. I think, and I was talking to somebody the other day when I was on the sell side. I remember having a conversation about the Permian in particular, and the notion of this phenomenon in a client call talking about rising GORs was, really the first they'd ever heard of it. And I think the investment community getting reacquainted with or understanding what this means is pretty important.
You bring up the interesting point about Prudhoe Bay that it comes down to how much gas you can handle. In effect, that's the whole Permian Basin, right? There are only so many pipelines take gas away. That's why gas trades for nothing.
And with high BTU gas, there's the other limiting factor is your NGL processing.
Yeah, well, where I was going with that is if you think about it, we've gone from balls to the wall drilling for oil, shale revolution, to building that gas processing capability. We were probably overbuilding because that's just what we do as an industry, because you got to build for the peak, to maybe let's keep production flat, slightly grow, to now we may be in a world where it wouldn't surprise me if over the next 6 months we're talking about multiple public companies coming out and saying, we've just laid our rigs down. We're going to pay off debt with our cash, buy stock back, and we'll start drilling when we hit higher prices again. You kind of get the feel we might be in range with that. So you potentially wind up with a lot of takeaway in that scenario. So you're going to have the capability of handling the gas in the oil. But where I was going with that is I wonder if potentially that causes you to produce faster each individual well, because you've got the takeaway for the natural gas. That's where I was going. I.e., if we do all that, do we wind up with bigger declines in 3 years? Were maybe our declines to some degree out in the Permian limited because of our gas takeaway and our gas processing? And I don't know the answer to that.
And the argument is you're going to have more gas volume per unit of oil volume to have to handle, process, and dispose of going forward, because you're in tier 2, et cetera. You're in areas that are relatively depleted. You might be closer to the bubble point, et cetera. So there's just going to be more gas per unit of oil, and that's what continuously rising GORs means. I don't think the Permian, this has been a while ago, was around 3,000 GOR, which means every million barrels a day you had 3 BCF a day of associated gas, which is not trivial.
All right. So we'll say this, so it will get into the AI engine at Collide. Also, when we search on the Collide video, people can see it. Today is the day that oil peaked in America, and it is, April 21st, 2025. Also, I think, didn't Prince die?
You're making the call? Yeah, this is the day that Prince died.
And this is the anniversary. Prince died and oil growth died. They will share.
You're making the call. You're making the call that oil growth died. You're not.
Yeah.
So
we're in decline.
Yeah, and if you look
we will not produce more than this in the foreseeable future.
I didn't grab it for the run of show, but Josh Young tweeted out something with a graph showing a disconnect. I'm sure you've seen it over time, where you have oil prices plotted against the inverse global inventories.
Yep.
And that correlation is usually pretty tight and holds. That's why we always say watch inventories.
Right.
In the last little while, there's been a big decoupling of that. I think it ultimately comes back, and if we compound it with your prediction of we've hit peak, at least for the time horizon that anyone cares about, then we ought to see that relationship resume if the physical markets are as tight as lower relative inventories would imply they should be. But the headwinds are coming from a lot of things, not the least of which is concerned about things like recession and what's going on with overall global demand. Although I did read, I think Chinese imports were, I'll say a record, maybe a year or two record. That could also be a lot of things too.
Yeah, we'll say this, Josh, come join us in the next couple of weeks and update on all this. All right, I definitely have to go pack to get ready for it, but I want to hear about BTA as well. This is kind of cool.
Yeah, I'm going to start this with a plug for a Substack called AFE Leaks, to which I subscribed last week. It's $100 a year, and have only seen a little bit in terms of their posts, but something that caught my eye in their weekly update, I believe it was on Sunday. They send out kind of a pretty granular breakdown of rig activity and changes, et cetera. But the more interesting ones are the color on some of the wells. I'm not sure where this information gets sourced, but I'll read it with great interest. Apparently a small independent out of Midland called BTA, never heard of them before, just released the rig on a $17.5 million 6,500-foot Barnett lateral in Crane County. And I do have long ago experience, and not successful as it was for kind of the same outcome for most people who dabbled out there in the deeper Permian Barnett and other horizons. All of that then was verticals. I think I want to say it was 2007, 2008. Quicksilver had a big position out there. Chesapeake had its Haley JV, and they were drilling some big, expensive wells. But apparently, this well took over 6 months, 5 sidetracks, and approaching $18 million. And I guess it was partially completed because they apparently made the decision to stop work and release the rig after the production casing got stuck 1,500 feet off the TD. So
we got to the point, because what we were doing at Kane, we were doing what I'd call early stage assets. We'd go, drill the first horizontal well in a county. We'd do the first big, frac, slick water frac on something. That's kind of was our niche. We weren't scared of raw acreage, but this was just typical of every first time well. We almost got to the point where in the economics, we were just junking the first well, because you get a new rig and you're drilling into a zone that you haven't really drilled into, because usually what your analogy is, or your comp is basically a bunch of old crappy verticals, right? And you needed to see production out of them. You actually wanted to see some variability in production. Every once in a while have a really good vertical, because it meant that, some sort of natural fracturing or structure or something meant that it caused the reservoir to produce. And so you go drill your horizontal. Maybe you don't have the greatest well control, 3D seismic. Did you really go out and shoot it when you're trying to minimize capital to go test rock? So this is kind of just par for the course. And so you always overspend on your first well. And the key, Brian Sheffield down in the Beetaloo, same thing. I mean, it's you overspend on your first well, but it's ultimately going to come back and you're going to see the deliverability, and you got to kind of parse it of what kind of production did I get per thousand, and start making those type of assumptions. So kudos to those guys.
I'm quite familiar with this, but I remember meeting with Geo Southern in 2009, and they were in the midst of drilling their second Eagle Ford well in Live Oak County. The first one they got down at about, it was close to 15 million. And in the second one, they'd cut that to under 10. and they certainly proved the thesis given the outcome there. I think that was the all-cash deal. Devon bought them shortly thereafter for, what was it, about $6 billion. So yeah, but the thing that caught my eye is, having clearing the cobwebs here, we were playing around in that super deep Barnett in the Permian with verticals and kind of following along with what Chesapeake was trying to do in Haley. That was significantly overpressured Barnett with a lot of gas. And so is this a gas objective? Do we need more primary gas objectives in the Permian? It'll be really interesting to, if we ever hear as to what the thesis is and what the play concept is.
Yeah, no, one just kind of final note, because I think this was an interesting lesson I learned. So hitting a new formation with a bigger hammer, it's all about how little can I spend to figure out what the rock can do. I can optimize later. You never, and then you pro forma into it. Okay, if I'm certain about what the rock will do, I can lean into, I'll drill cheaper 5 to 10 wells from now and stuff like that. That whole mindset actually gets turned on its head 180 degrees when you go to spacing. Because then, when you space, what you needed to do was actually go ahead and drill all the wells at once, i.e. spend more money up front. You probably, in effect, needed to leave some reserve behind. If you thought 8 wells was the right spacing, you probably, the first time you did one, you needed to do 3 or maybe 4. Because we found there were times where you over drilled. It wasn't just a case of you spent too much capital to get the oil and gas out. You actually damaged the reservoir down there, and you would get 1/3 of the reserves you were expecting. So yeah, no, it's crazy how all those lessons we learned about how to create a new play and sell it to Chesapeake or XTO or whoever the buyer de jour was. When we actually had to then go develop it, we had to go learn a whole new set of rules too.
Yeah, and they're at least the public side's littered with a few high-profile examples. Most notable one that I can recall was Concho's Dominator pad.
Yeah,
they spent upwards of $200 million, and it was not a flame out, but 1 plus 1 didn't equal 2. It equaled significantly less than 2. And when you're talking about, okay, on a single well basis, 5 to 8 million, not a lot, but you look, as you're describing that rapid fire development where you're spending a lot of money on multiple downspaced infills and all the facilities, et cetera, you can get to a few $100 million in a hurry. And ultimately it's kind of like one of those big ticket deep water dry holes we used to write about.
It was totally okay to overspend on figuring out what the rock will do on a first time play. Totally not okay to overspend first time you try to figure out spacing. Yep. Go underspend. All right, I'm going to go pack so that I can go to Vegas. If the BTA guys are out there watching, come on the podcast, tell us what happened. Tell us about the play if you've got your acreage locked up. I think that'd be cool to hear.
So am I supposed to say good luck or break a leg?
Yeah, something like that. Know when to hold them, know when to fold them.
That's right. All right, man. Safe travels. We look.
Thank you much.
We look forward to your Vibe download, the World Oil Man's Poker Tournament, in the midst of all this turmoil. What the vibe is.
We
know you're a little shy to talk to people, but
absolutely.
Just have a couple of drinks, you'll be fine.
There we go. All right, everybody. If you like the podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, share it with a friend. Mark and I will be back next week. We'll try to get Kirk out And like I said, Josh, if you want to come back, we'd love to have you on. See ya.
Peace.